And you know what else? My days of being mean and insulting are over. From here on out, I'm going to be the nice, kind Peter Griffin.
You can't walk out on me. I'm the president.
Well, you're not a very good one. Like that guy. Or that one. Or that one. Which one is that, anyway?
I'm Grover Cleveland, the only president to be married in the White House.
Oh, what a nice story.
It's a great story. I married a girl who I'd raised since the time she was 11 years old.
Well, that guy's not getting a musical.
I gotta confess, I've never actually read anything you've written. Tell me, Doctor, what exactly is your position at the gallery?
I sit in the corner and look at the paintings.
That is brilliant. If only more scholars would do that, just sit and look. Not lecture and write and argue. Just sit and look at the paintings themselves. Now that is brilliant.
It's not something that I talk about a great deal. In fact, I think we've only casually mentioned it a few times over the 15, 16 years I've been doing this. I'm an art guy. I like art. I mean, I don't know everything there is to know about art. I never studied art. I didn't go to college for art. I didn't go to school for it. But I like art. I know what I like. And like most people, because I know what I like, I can enjoy it. Like Mr. Bean's character there, Dr. Bean. I like to sit and look at paintings. I don't need to analyze it. I don't need to do any of that stuff. My favorite painting is a painting by Raphael. It's the School of Athens. I have a large print of that in storage right now. I still haven't unpacked it, but it's one of my favorite paintings, and that's a painting that you can spend days analyzing, if not years. But I also have a very small but tasteful collection of Impressionist seascapes. I do like Impressionist painting, and I love the ocean, so seascapes sort of fit naturally. I like seascapes, and I have a very small but tasteful collection of Impressionist seascaping. Seascaping? Is that a word? Seascapes that dot the house here and there. And I've spent the better part of 30 years collecting. I enjoy them. I like to just sit and look at them. It's kind of an interesting thing. But the thing about art is that it reflects culture and society. Art is something that draws from what's happening around it. And it either tries to portray what's happening in a very heroic way, or it attempts to criticize it. And I think probably in the last, 5 or 6 decades, that's become more the norm. Art tends to be outlandish because it's critical. It's trying to attract attention. It's trying to make people think, which, okay, I get it, but it's not really what I'm into. It's not really what I'm about, but it isn't what I like. And so for my money, and it's just my money, it's not yours. You might like it. I don't. But for my money, most modern art is, just crap. That said, I do like the Impressionist masters. And I do like to look at historical paintings of historical events. Now, again, I'm enough of a historian that I spend a lot of time nitpicking them, going, well, that didn't happen, and that wasn't there, and which really isn't the point that the artist was trying to make, but it's what I enjoy doing. I bring all this up because, as was pointed out there, Grover Cleveland was, he didn't have the highest reputation amongst most Americans in his presidency because of the oogie relationship that he had with his soon-to-be wife. I mean, it was kind of weird. I mean, it really was. So that kind of turned some people off, and it was used in campaign trails. But you can go through every president in our history, with the probable exception of one, and do that. And even the one is now being criticized because, that's what we do now. The United States of America has a portrait gallery in which hang the portraits of the 46 presidents. Well, they're not all there yet because we're still working on them. There's actually only 44 portraits there right now because, well, we'll get to that in just a minute for obvious reasons. But there are a lot of other presidents that hang there, and there are a lot of other people that, are questionable. There's lots of questions these days over Andrew Jackson. Now, the thing about these portraits is that they're done in the style of the era in which they were serving, obviously. Most of these paintings, particularly the early ones, follow really the Renaissance idea of portrait painting. They're either very plain, there's really two schools here. They're either very plain, they're just the person, or they're the person with indicators, things that show who they were and what they did. In Jackson's case, the famous painting of Andrew Jackson, if you were to look at the painting, and those of you watching the video will see it, it's just very plain. In fact, it's not even complete. That's part of it. It's just his head, his neck, and shoulders, and that's all it is. And he's looking off into the distance, as if the artist is trying to tell you that Jackson was always looking forward. And of course, Jackson is now criticized roundly for his mistreatment of Native Americans, his policies that saw many of the Native American tribes suppressed and mistreated. And because of that, as you know, there's a great movement to remove Jackson, to cancel Andrew Jackson, as it were, a man of the people unlike any other had ever been before, or really had ever been since, probably since 2016, before 2016, a man of the people who was dearly loved by the people. But since we're judging history by our culture and our debates, Andrew Jackson's now a bad guy. James Buchanan, and this, for those of you looking at the video, this is what I'm talking about with the Renaissance portrait painting. James Buchanan is pictured standing. He's looking directly at you. He's got his hand firmly on the table behind him, and on the table are a lot of papers and books and the likes of that, as if he is trying to portray himself as a learned man and a man who is of action. There's a chair behind him, but he's not sitting in it. And yet Buchanan is generally considered to be the worst president in the history of the United States. Now, I know that that's a subjective list, and there are many of you, possibly even some listening, who think that there might be others who are worse. But really, when you look at it objectively, James Buchanan is the bottom of the barrel. This is a man who, despite his penchant for action, literally stood by and did nothing from November of 1860 to March of 1861, and allowed southern states to secede without any resistance, surrendered federal territories and the likes, and equipment and the likes of that. And in many ways, you can lay the Civil War at his feet. Not all of them, not completely, and I get that. But he was very ineffective, and today he's criticized for that. Thomas Jefferson, again in the Renaissance type painting, he's pictured sitting, glancing off to the viewer's right, his left. Behind him is a statue, probably of a Greek or Roman goddess. The knowledge elements of it. He's got his hands on papers. And of course, Jefferson today is roundly criticized and canceled for being a slaveholder. We can't honor him. This is literally right out of the Tetley cycle, folks, that we talked about a few weeks ago. This idea that democracy reaches a point where it begins to denigrate its own heroic values, those things that made it what it is now. Not English speaking. And this is what is happening, of course, with Thomas Jefferson. He is being ridiculed and canceled and complained about because of his slaveholding, despite the fact that he was a fairly strong advocate for doing away with slavery. In his own words, I just don't know how to do it, and neither does anybody else. and neither do any of those people who are criticizing him today. Perhaps one of the most controversial presidents, Rutherford B. Hayes. Again, just him. He's staring off to the viewer's left, looking into the distance, but it's just him. There's no papers. There's no chair. He's not standing on anything. Rutherford B. Hayes, of course, the man who essentially sold out the Reconstructed South to be president of the United States for 4 years. We talked about this extensively last summer during the 1876 series that we did for Constitution Thursday, and how he ended up in the White House. But in the process of this, he, in that election of 1876 and the subsequent presidency of Rutherford B. Hayes, very ineffective, and essentially led to the foundation of Jim Crow laws. He allowed that to happen. He's criticized for that. My favorite president, I know it sounds weird thing to say, but I say that tongue in cheek. He's not really my favorite president, but I think he's one of the most interesting people to ever be president of the United States, the former governor of Ohio, Warren G. Harding. Warren Harding is standing in his portrait, and you can see that the times are kind of changing. It's the 1920s. He's got the high collar, the tie. We've put the presidential seal up there now. He's holding a book in his hand with his glasses in his hand. Prominently, his ring is on his left finger. He's portraying great strength and great optimism. And yet, of course, Warren G. Harding goes down as one of the worst presidents because of his corrupt cabinet, mostly. Whereas Alice Roosevelt once said of him, he wasn't a bad man, he was just a slob. That doesn't come through in the portrait of him that hangs in our National Gallery, but he was very slovenly in his management of things. And he allowed a great deal of negative things to happen because of that. Of course, out of him came, when he passed away, came one of the best presidents we ever had, a guy by the name of Calvin Coolidge. So, you got to take the good with the bad. There are other presidents, Richard Nixon. His portrait that hangs in the National Gallery is kind of unique. It was painted by Norman Rockwell. And I'm fascinated by this painting because of the way Nixon looks. And I feel like in many ways, I know Nixon better than many other presidents. He's got his hand, he's sitting on a chair, but he's sitting sideways. He's got one hand over the edge. His chin is resting in the other hand, but not the way you would normally. It's like a fist with his thumb there, and he's looking right at you. And he's got that Nixonian smile that was so familiar to those of us who grew up in the Nixonian era. He looks very confident. He looks very at ease. And yet he's not. You know that he, again, is criticized for his war policies. He's criticized for many things that went on outside of just Watergate. I mean, it's easy to focus on that, the corruption, the stonewalling, and all that. But you need to keep in mind that he was also roundly criticized for his vice presidential term. It was full of controversy. And then later his presidential term, bombing of Laos, invasion of Cambodia, things like that. His enemies list, his problems that he had. And of course, he is roundly criticized and in many cases hated. I think probably my personal favorite president, he's either number one or number two. It kind of varies for the day. John F. Kennedy. Now, I will grant you that I have some bias here, but Kennedy's portrait that hangs in the National Gallery is one that at long last deviates from the Renaissance school of portraiting, where you're either standing with stuff or you're doing by yourself. This is where they started to break away into the 1960s and 1950s, and the counterculture wasn't there yet, but it was starting to, the avant-garde art was really starting to, and so it's a very impressionist painting with a lot of blue and green in it. And it kind of looks like refrigerator art. I'll be the first to admit it. I don't like the painting. I don't think that this is the one that they should hang in the National Gallery. I really don't. because it doesn't really, to me, represent what John F. Kennedy represented. But it is representative of the art of the day, which was very get outside the box kind of thing. And Kennedy was kind of a get outside the box person. Even he, though, roundly criticized today. Bay of Pigs invasion, his dalliances, and things that he didn't tell the American people that today, if the American people had found out that a president knew about or did these or had these conditions, it would be a major controversy. But in those days, we just painted over it with bright colors and made it look kind of Art Deco, and we went on our way. Later, they would return to the more traditional school. Ronald Reagan's portrait, one of my favorites. Again, Reagan and Kennedy kind of swap back and forth between 1, 2, and 3. I'll get to my actual favorite here in a moment. But Reagan is he's portrayed standing on the portico, leaning up against the wall there, one hand in his pocket, jacket undone, arm hanging down, very casual. But he's wearing a suit with a tie, and he's looking right at you, and he's got that Reagan smile. And of course, today, and even then, Reagan heavily criticized, complained about, hated. Although it was just a microcosm of what was to come. My personal favorite president, I consider him to be my president, George Herbert Walker Bush. There's plenty to criticize about Bush. Don't get me wrong. That doesn't mean I agreed with everything he said. It doesn't mean I agree with everything he did. But he was a traditionalist. He was a Navy man. He was a veteran, combat veteran. And he was a man that when he looked at us and said, I care about you, I believed him. And I knew that he was telling me the truth. I knew that he wouldn't always be able to do what he wanted to do because there were extenuating circumstances and other things going on. But his portrait, of course, he's standing there with his hands on the chair, which kind of says to me, hey, it's almost to me as I look at the portrait, almost as if he's saying, Dave, come here and sit down for a minute. That's the feeling that I get from that portrait, which is the feeling that I have about George Herbert Walker Bush, which is why I like that painting. This is why I liked him as a president. His son, who is reviled by many people in the country, his portrait is a little more casual. He's sitting on what appears to be the end of a couch, no tie, arms folded across. And of course, he's, you know the criticisms that W. Bush has faced through the years. Then you come to President Obama's famous portrait. Now, I'll be honest with you, as from an art standpoint, I personally think the portrait is hideous. That's my opinion. Doesn't mean that other people don't like it. And I understand that there are a great number of people who do like it because of what it represents. I understand that he was concerned about being seated because he did not want to appear regal or, like a king. But it doesn't really come across that way in the painting. He's got his arms folded and he's sitting in the chair, and it's the background that is so distracting to me. Now, that's my opinion. But even Obama, of course, faces criticism, and even there are many people, even on the left, who have roundly criticized President Obama because he didn't go far enough for them. And so they see him, I've talked to them, I can say this with confidence, there are many leftists who see him as a failure because he did not succeed in doing the things that they expected him to do. Even he is criticized amongst these portraits that hang in our National Gallery. Perhaps the most controversial one, though, is, of course, William Jefferson Clinton's portrait. The official portrait, which no longer hangs in the official portrait gallery. I don't know if you knew that or not. The official portrait of him as president does not hang in the gallery. There's some reasons for that. The portrait itself has been lambasted because there are a lot of things with the portrait that people don't like. They don't like the way his hands are on his hip. They don't like his smile. His staff did not like his original shoes. Originally, his shoes were brown, and they made the artist repaint them black. But perhaps one of the most criticized parts of the portrait, and he's standing next to a fireplace, one of the most critical things about the portrait, there are a couple of shadows that hang in multiple directions. There's 3, 4, 5 shadows that you can see in the portrait that you don't really connect if you're not paying attention to. 9 years after this portrait was painted, the artist was about to pass away. And the artist, the person who painted it, claimed that those shadows, those of you looking at the video can see it, he claims that those shadows represent the blue dress of Monica Lewinsky, that they take the shape of the blue dress, and that they represent what he believed to be one of the most crooked, lying, misbehaving people he had ever met, one of the biggest tricksters he'd ever met in his life. And he was not happy with his painting. He was not happy with having the painting, and he wanted to make sure that he included those subtle reminders of Bill Clinton's character. Well, of course, this created a great deal of furor because, how dare you do that to a president who was beloved by many, at least 40% of the country. This portrait does not hang in the gallery these days. The one that actually hangs there now representing Bill Clinton, for those of you watching the video, is this, which is, it's like they took a photoshopped picture of him on a bad hair day and they did that oil painting setting on Photoshop and then pixelated it. If you didn't know that it was Bill Clinton, if there wasn't a thing hanging there going, this is Bill Clinton, you wouldn't know that it was Bill Clinton. That's the portrait that's hanging in our National Portrait Gallery right now as representative of William Jefferson Clinton. Now, why am I bringing all this up? What do you care? Dave, are you really going to sit here for 30 minutes and analyze art? A little bit, yeah. Because art is culture, and culture is society, and society is reflected in its art. And the Smithsonian has informed us that they are having a real problem right now with the National Portrait Gallery of presidents because so many of the presidents are controversial in ways that cannot be really resolved by the Smithsonian. And so they are desperately trying to find ways to put these portraits, quote, in context for the modern viewer, whatever the heck that means. So imagine trying to explain to people Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, also owned slaves. And not talk about the fact that he wanted to do away with slaves, and that his original draft of the Declaration of Independence was highly critical of slavery. It was taken out in deference to southern slaveholding states. How do you explain James Buchanan to people? I mean, okay, he was president, but what did he do? Millard Fillmore. Millard Fillmore is such an absolute zero as president. I didn't even look at his portrait because really, who cares? You've got others, Tyler. You've got Harrison's. You've got a few others along the way, a couple of Roosevelts and those kinds of things. But how do you put them in context of modern times so that they don't offend people, so that they don't come in here and go, well, we need to cancel that. We need that painting offends me. We've got to take it down. And the Smithsonian has found itself on the horns of a dilemma in the sense that we have to show these portraits. These are the presidents. But at the same time, we really don't want to put up with people coming in here going, ooh, that offends me. And so they're trying to figure out ways to put these portraits into a context that won't cause offense, which is insane to me, but that's what it is. And of course, all of this leads to the last two presidents whose portraits are not in the National Gallery. The current president, President Biden's portrait, has not been painted yet, hasn't been dealt with yet because modern presidents, for some reason, seem to be too busy to sit for these portraits. That was part of the problem with Bill Clinton's portrait, was that he didn't want to. He was too busy. Others, Reagan, Bush, the likes of George Herbert Walker Bush didn't have a problem, but W. Bush kind of, he was kind of fancy about the whole thing. Obama didn't want to look a certain way. He wanted to make sure that he came across a certain way. It's harder for modern people to understand what sitting for a portrait really means. And today's leaders who are literally plugged in 24/7 see themselves as far too busy to be doing something as mundane or as arcane as sitting for a portrait. Personally, I think it's important, but that's my own opinion. And of course, the big problem is Donald J. Trump. Because Donald J. Trump's portrait has not yet been painted. Now, why? I don't know. It could be a scheduling thing. It could be that he was too busy to sit while he was president. It's really not that big of a deal. I mean, many of the portraits of presidents that hang in the galleries were painted years after they had been president because that's when they finally got around to doing it or purchasing it. But Trump's picture presents a different little problem, doesn't it? The context that the Smithsonian is concerned about is how do we hang a portrait of a guy in the gallery who's the only president to be impeached twice? How do we do that without causing some people to absolutely lose their freaking minds and go, cancel that, you can't have that portrait there? And it comes back to this idea that we think somehow or another that if we don't hang Donald Trump's picture in the National Portrait Gallery, that'll make it all go away. That'll make it all better. All of a sudden, everybody that was hurt or offended or whatever while Donald Trump was president will suddenly be miraculously healed because his portrait isn't in the gallery of the portrait gallery. That's seemingly the thinking that we have. If we tear down a statue, all of the bad things that were represented by that statue's person 150, 200 years ago will suddenly vanish, right? I mean, that's the mentality we seem to have. The Smithsonian, which is our national repository of our history, our story, is literally debating today whether or not they will actually hang Donald J. Trump's portrait in the Portrait Gallery of Presidents. They are literally debating whether or not they will essentially leave a blank spot in our history because they don't like that history, or they're afraid that some people don't like that history, and consequently, we have to kowtow to people who would rather erase history than learn from history. Whether you're talking about Thomas Jefferson, James Buchanan, Millard Fillmore, Rutherford B. Hayes, any of them, isn't really the issue. The issue is if you're judging history by your own cultural values of today, everybody is going to come up short. Your own grandparents are going to come up short, if not your parents, and if not you. You've changed in the time you've been alive. And if you haven't yet, I guarantee you will. Erasing history, ignoring history, to claim that it doesn't exist by simply leaving a blank spot doesn't teach us anything. And more importantly, what happens 100 years from now when somebody's trying to find out what happened there? One of the big problems with Egyptian history, we were talking about this on Sunday with Rod, was the blank spots. The spots where they tried to chisel out history, where they tried to erase it. In many ways, it Streisand affected on them. In many ways, the attempt to erase Egyptian history 3,000 freaking years ago made that history more familiar to us today than some of the other stuff. Will leaving out Donald J. Trump from the Smithsonian's Gallery of Portraits backfire? Or will it even get noticed? Personally, I suspect it will backfire. But I hope that cooler heads prevail and they don't do this incredibly stupid thing this incredibly stupid way.